Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to our final election double shot where we bring in the finance spokespeople for the main parties in Parliament and ask them all about interest rates and house prices and the things we care about here at interest.co.nz. And welcome to David Parker, who is the Deputy Leader and the Finance Spokesman for Labour. We always start with a free kick here, David. Why should interest viewers vote for Labour?
For a stronger economy that pushes from overinvestment in speculative assets into productive investment, pushes the economy from volume towards higher value exports, and also has fairer societal outcomes in dealing with some of the pressures that we've got around the likes of housing and electricity prices.
Let's focus on that volume to value thing. What are you going to do with monetary policy and interest rates?
Well, we think our mix of policy is essentially more of our own capital saved through a universal KiwiSaver, pushed into the right parts of the economy through a capital gains tax excluding the family home, allied with research and development tax credits and some accelerated depreciation to encourage investment in increased value of output. But with all of those things, we think that it's not enough to get us over our 40-year current account deficit, and then we've got to address the overvaluation of our currency and our structurally higher interest rates compared with the rest of the world. And we don't think that you can overcome those problems without some changes to monetary policy as well. And that mix of policies work together to supplement monetary policy, put less pressure on the overnight cash rate, and get our currency back to more competitive levels.
So how would the Reserve Bank do that? At the moment they focus purely on inflation. What would a Reserve Bank Act under Labour look like?
The inflation control target remains, and indeed the wording of that part of their mandate would remain unchanged, but then we ask them to do it in the manner which best assists in attaining an external surplus over the economic cycle. So what would that mean in practice? Well, they might use their macroprudential tools differently. They would definitely take into account the lower consumption pressures that there are during the period when we're introducing compulsory savings and lifting the rate by 0.25% each side a year to get from where we are now at 6 to a total of 9%. They would find that they have less need to control asset price inflation through loan-to-valuation ratios or higher interest rates in the manner that they're currently doing, because we would have better housing policy, both in terms of controlling some of the demand pressures through capital gains tax and bans on overseas buyers, but also through our supply initiatives in the housing side.
On the issue of the Reserve Bank and banking, we've got a lot of term deposit customers who look at interest.co. What's your view on open bank resolution and whether we should have a deposit insurance scheme?
We've said that we're quite attracted to the Australian idea, where the co-banks, the other banks, are effectively forced to be a guarantor of the depositors of the bank of the bank that goes under, if you like. So they have to stand behind a guarantee of other banks' deposits. We also think that open bank resolution, where you have a limited tier of lending which is guaranteed, is probably prudent. We haven't set a figure as to what we think that level of guarantee should be, but we don't support the idea that the government should guarantee all bank deposits up to all levels.
So in the Australian system, would the banks pay some sort of deposit insurance?
My understanding is that in the Australian situation, I haven't looked at this for a while, so forgive me if I've got it wrong, but from memory, they effectively all guarantee each other's, and they pick up the cost if one of them falls over. So I'm not sure whether there's a premium that's paid one to t'other, or whether that's effectively just an underwrite. I think it's an underwrite from memory.
KiwiSaver, we have a lot of KiwiSaver viewers.
Yeah.
What's Labour's policy on KiwiSaver?
View KiwiSaver as being really, really important. We have to protect its reputation, because otherwise we'll run out of community support for KiwiSaver being a cornerstone of our savings culture in New Zealand. I don't think there's any doubt that the Australian strength of the Australian economy is in part underpinned by their work-based savings record. It's one of the reasons why they own their banks, plus most of ours. So we think that KiwiSaver should be made effectively compulsory for everyone that's in work. on virtually identical schemes as apply in Australia. If you're a part-time worker and you work very low hours, you won't be in Australia. But if you're someone that's working full-time, even on the minimum wage, you'll be in Australia and New Zealand. Hardship provisions and holiday provisions are tightened also.
Is there a danger, though, with a compulsory KiwiSaver scheme that increases the pressure in the long run to remove universality for New Zealand superannuation?
We've been expressed that that's not our view. So has the Financial Services Council, who have been one of the people who've been pushing the debate along about retirement savings in New Zealand. Our superannuation scheme is one of the best in the world. So long as we have the age of eligibility at a sustainable level, it can be sustained into the future. If you move to means testing on an asset or income basis for New Zealand superannuation, which we oppose in the Labour Party, particularly if it was income tested as opposed to asset testing, you would cause people to retire at the age of eligibility for retirement instead of working part-time past it. That would not be in the interests of a lot of the people who would be forced to choose between one or t'other, because they would suffer a lower standard of living, and neither would it be in the interests of the New Zealand economy, because we'd have lower economic output and lower tax take. So our current settings are right for universal superannuation, and it's one of the reasons why the Labour Party is so intent on addressing the age of eligibility, because we want to ensure its long-term survival.
On that eligibility age, and also on compulsion, isn't it really tough on people on lower incomes, maybe in manual work, who are either just exhausted when they get to the age of 65, or they're on a low income, and having a good chunk of it, pushed into KiwiSaver makes life even harder?
Increasing the age of eligibility whenever you do it, of course, is hard on people who would have otherwise got it from 65, who might get it at 65 2 months or 65 4 months. Transition's very gentle. Indeed, longevity rises at a higher rate than the proposed increase in age. So, I mean, it's the underlying drivers of this are so clear. Next year, government spends more on superannuation than it spends on education. That's from preschool, primary, intermediate, secondary, tertiary, trade, training combined. Already superannuation that costs more than all benefits combined. That's unemployment, DPB, sickness, invalids, widows, which are their old names, plus the family working for families tax credits, plus the accommodation supplement. And it's in part driven by the fact that we're living longer, and that. So, having said all of that, there are also people who would suffer hardship between the age of 65 and 67 if they can't work in their normal work because they're worn out. And there's a range of occupations that could be true of manual work, whether it's working on the roads or some building trades, cleaners, some rest home workers. There will be a percentage of the workforce who need the equivalent of superannuation from age 65 if they can't work in their normal work. And so we've said on a needs basis, effectively, there'll be income and asset tests around this. If you can't work in your normal job, you'll get super from age 65 to 67 anyway.
And what about this link to the average wage, the 66% of the average wage in NZ Super, which means we're actually seeing a widening of the gap between those who are older on pensions and those who are on other types of benefits, let alone on lower wages.
It's also the reason why we've got low rates of poverty and old age, and I think we've got that right. I don't want the relative standard of living of our elderly to decline over time, and their relative standard of living would if you took away the link with average wages and left it only with inflation. So we support it staying linked to both wages and inflation.
What is Labour's policy on income taxes?
We think income taxes in New Zealand are about right. We've got no plan to reduce them immediately. At the last election, we had a 5,000 tax-free zone for everyone. The way we've cut our numbers this time, we can't afford to do it. We do think that income taxes on those above $150,000 need to lift a little, and that the trust rate, which otherwise, if it's not adjusted, it presents an arbitrage opportunity, should lift to 36 cents also. Our more important policy by far is our capital gains tax. It is the most important policy that is on offer from any political party at this election.
Well, there's been quite a bit of debate. What's the situation if, let's say, my mum and dad, pass on and the house is for sale? How does capital gains tax apply there?
Yes, well, there's been some misrepresentations around that by our political opponents who've managed to convince people that they should be scared that it's an inheritance tax. The capital gains tax is never an inheritance tax on any asset, never. In respect of the family home, it's really even easier because the family home is never taxed with the capital gains tax. So if my family home, I never pay tax on my family home, irrespective of whether it's in my own name or in a family trust. If my parents were to die and leave me a home, neither the estate pays capital gains tax on my parents' former family home, nor me. If I choose to sell it, then there is no capital gains tax on it. If I choose to convert it from a family home into a rental property, then it drops into the capital gains tax regime, not as an inherited property, but as a rental property from the time it's rented out effectively. So if I then, if I inherited it, let's say it had been worth $100,000, just to pick a number, when my parents bought it, and it was worth $200,000 when I inherited it, then the starting value for me as a rental property would be $200,000. And if it went up to $250,000 and I sold it 5 years in the future, then I would pay 15% capital gain on that gain since I inherited it.
What about the argument that a capital gains tax, particularly on farmland, would actually discourage a lot of the production and value add that you're...
It's quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite. And actually, many of the cleverer end of the farming sector actually support a capital gains tax for that very reason. They think that farms, just as other businesses, should invest on the basis of productivity and profitability rather than land value. And so, no, it encourages that. Also, in respect of the farm, the dwelling and curtilage, if it's owner-occupied and it's the principal family home, that's excluded just as it is for everyone else. But other than that, a farm is a business like any other business, so I don't think there should be a special rule.
There's some quirky things with capital gains tax. Let's say, for example, I'm living in a house for 3 days of the week and the other 4 days of the week I'm travelling into town for work or whatever. How do I decide which is my family home?
Well, look, these issues, when you get down to that level of detail, they apply in every other country that has a capital gains tax. It is no coincidence that the IMF, the OECD, the Reserve Bank, the Treasury think that we actually need to address this imbalance in our tax system. All of these issues are dealt with in the other countries around the world that have capital gains tax, which is virtually every other developed country. And they do it not because they want to introduce complexity into the tax system, and it does add some more complexity, but they do it for two main reasons. One is it makes the economy stronger because it pushes capital to being invested where it is most productively deployed rather than on the basis of a tax advantage, i.e. it encourages productive investment rather than speculation. And the second issue is that no one can argue against the proposition that it is unfair that wealthy people pay lower overall rates on their income than middle-income New Zealanders. It is not fair that someone working for the minimum wage at a supermarket, if they're single, is paying tax on every dollar they earn, but someone who is wealthy can construct their affairs in a way that they don't pay tax on their economic income. So for both reasons of fairness and shape of the economy, we need a capital gains tax.
We have a lot of farmers who look at our site and people think about the farming sector and dairying in particular. What's Labor's view on swimmable rivers and on charging for water for irrigation?
I've got what I think is a sensible but quite simple view in respect of rivers. The most important river to most New Zealanders is the river they live close to, and they want it to be clean enough for them to swim in. And that's effectively what the Labour Party says. We say that the minimum standard for water quality in our rivers ought to be swimmability, not wadeability. How you get there is you have a national policy statement in the form that was inherited by the government. It dropped out of the system just before Labour left office last time, and they spiked. It was overseen by the former principal planning judge in New Zealand, Judge Shepherd, and it essentially said clean rivers ought to stay clean, dirty rivers ought to be cleaned up over a generation, and to stop clean rivers getting dirtier, intensification of land use, which necessarily carries with it more fertiliser, or generally carries it with it more fertiliser, more livestock effluent, because you've got more livestock per hectare, has to be controlled in some way rather than be a permitted activity, so that you can control environmental behaviour so that the overall land of the whole farming unit, including the expansion, does not increase the load on waterways. That's not too much to ask for.
Even in towns, though, where there's some pretty dirty rivers in the towns and cities.
Yeah, well, look, no one's saying that at all times all rivers are going to be clean. Once you have a flood coming through a river or a flood coming through a city, washing stuff into waterways, you are, for a moment, for a period of time, you do have waterways that aren't clean enough to swim in. No one's saying that flood flows should be clean enough to swim in, but the basic premise that we should be driving towards, both in our cities and in our rural areas, is rivers being clean enough to swim in.
Also on tax, GST and GST online, we've got a lot of retailers and people who buy things online.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
The government's got a working paper out on that at the moment. I think who is elected is going to have to bring that to a head. We've also said, in respect of some of the you're talking about mainly online retailing,
Yep.
I take it. We think another tax area of tax avoidance that needs to be clamped down on, because it's not fair to New Zealand businesses and hollows out both our tax base but also our economic base, is some of the online transactions. For example, Google and Facebook take hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising revenue out of New Zealand, and they pay no tax on it because they construct their transactions in a way that notionally are offshore, despite the fact that they are effectively a transaction within the New Zealand economy. That is unfair competition for other news media who pay GST and income tax on their revenues, or GST on their revenues, income tax on their profits, and we've said that we'll clamp down on that, and if necessary we will impose a transaction tax on them. This already happens in respect of some jurisdictions in respect of online gambling, starting in the United Kingdom. It's effectively collected through the banking system on a turnover basis, and if people don't file an income tax return, it becomes a final tax. We already do the same thing in New Zealand in respect of visiting bans and things. If they don't file a tax return, they've got to effectively have paid a withholding tax while they were here, and it becomes a final tax.
So you're suggesting a type of turnover tax for people buying things via, Google, Facebook, Amazon, that sort of thing?
I was actually specifically referring then to the advertising revenue. In respect of goods that come across the border, then there should be enforcement of GST at the border. I think the Inland Revenue, and whether it's us or the National Party, that issue looks like it's being addressed through a working paper that the current government's got going now.
David Parker, thank you very much for coming to interest.co.nz. There we have it, David Parker from the Labour Party. That is the last of our election double shots. We'll be looking forward to election night, September 20, to see how it all worked out. Thank you very much. I'm Bernard Hickey for interest.co.nz.